And we are live. Welcome back, Don and David. Thank you for joining me again. Um, it's awesome how many topics you guys dive into. And, like obviously, as many people know, I've connected with you several times on the fallacy of germ theory, and you dive really deep into that topic on your book, What Really Makes You Ill. If this is your first time hearing from Don or David, we're going to touch on something today, and this is actually part two. I recommend checking out part one on the nature of reality, but they also dive very deep into many other health related topics. So I highly recommend checking them out there. And it's their website is whatreallymakesyouill.com. But so today, this is again part two of the nature of reality. And last time we left off, um, kind of left with a cliffhanger, David. You talked about the nature of time, space and time, probabilities, and then you said we don't have a fixed past, and then we had to end the episode. So let's go ahead and pick up where we left off with time.
Okay. Yes, well, just it's worth probably just spending literally a few minutes, particularly for those who've not watched the first one. We determined in the first episode that we did of this that our five senses only give us a very filtered view of whatever reality is, whatever people think reality is. Our five senses give us a very limited view of it, and not least of which is time. So we want, with the aid of, if we can make it work, with the aid of a few little pictures, we're hoping that we can sort of get our heads around this sort of quite mind-boggling concept that time actually only exists in our minds. It only exists in consciousness. It's not a real thing, and neither is space. So space and time are constructions of consciousness. So we're hoping we can demonstrate that with a few pictures, and then hopefully explain how we can set ourselves free from it and realize how it works, and how, as I left it last time, that because we don't have a fixed past, we have multiple pasts with all sorts of multiple probabilities in it, and we can pick and choose them, and that can affect what we think of as our present. So I don't know if we can. I'm going to hand to Dawn to see if she can press the buttons on this and see if we can share a screen and bring up a picture. So if smoke stops coming in, hopefully this will work. Okay. So just bear with us while we get a picture up here. And right, we actually want a different slide to that. We probably go for times arrow. We'll start there. Okay. I don't know if everyone can see that.
Yep.
You can see that. Okay. It's just a little illustration to, because physicists know the term times arrow, where we, under normal circumstances, we're led to believe that so-called time started in the dim and distant past and progressed to what we think of as the present and proceeds into the future. And that's a concept that quantum physicists will now regard as being untrue. They actually accept that times arrow is just a convenient concept. It isn't actually a truth, and that quantum physics is much happier with the concept that so-called past, present, and future exist simultaneously. So maybe if we move on to the next slide, if we can do that. So what we're saying is that time is only in the mind. That's quite a nice little illustration there. It doesn't exist externally to us. Okay. So let's see if we can expand on that a little more and look at the next slide. Okay. Now this may look a little bizarre. A godlike position, we've called it. Now, this is, we often call it the fabric of time and space, because it is a piece of material that we commandeered to try and explain this. So if you can imagine, we'll call it, we're in our godlike position, and we're gazing down at all of these squares represent, if you can imagine, off to your left, as you look at your screen, the past, and in the center of the checked material is the present, and off to the right is the future. And all of the events that could be happening and have happened are represented by the squares. Okay, so as we can see in our godlike position, we can see past, present, and future, and all events of past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, represented by all the squares, and of course imagining that they extend out into infinity. Okay, so let's elaborate on that a little more. And now, with these very expensive steel rings, we're representing the very small ring in the middle, which is circling one square. Imagine that to be ego consciousness, so represented by just the five senses, okay, and confined by ego, represented by the ring. We'll talk about the bigger ring in a moment. So as you can see, that ego consciousness, the five senses, is just surrounding one square. And imagine that square to be an event, one part of an event. And as ego moves from one square to the next adjacent square to its right, it's created time because it's moving from one square to the other and progresses seemingly from ego consciousness's point of view. It's creating time as it progresses from one event to another. Okay. And it looks to its left, if you like, each of the squares to its left in a straight line, which are held in memory, are what it considers its past events. And it only sees one stream of them. But as we can see from still in our godlike position, we can see that there's lots of so-called past events. Okay, but ego consciousness is only aware of the one square, the one event in what it thinks of as its present. And as it moves, as I say, from its present position to the right, seemingly its future, it moves one square at a time and has created time. Now we'll talk about the bigger ring. Now the bigger ring is representing expanded awareness, or an expanded consciousness, if you like, which is still part of consciousness, but it's, as you can see, it's aware of more squares, so more events. It has a greater awareness of reality, if you like, but still not the complete picture, because it's not encompassing from that area of consciousness. It's not encompassing the entire view that we have in our godlike position, but nonetheless it has a greater awareness of reality. Now, whatever the circumstances that our expanded consciousness, represented by the big ring, has, it still has to pass that information to the ego consciousness, and it has to bypass the inner steel ring. And probably the steel ring is probably a good representation, because for the outer ring, expanded consciousness, to get information to the inner ring, it has to get through the beliefs, hopes, fears of ego consciousness. And of course, ego consciousness is restricted view of reality.
Is that why the center ring is much thicker?
Yes, it's not to take the representation too far, but yes, it can be. Some people's ring can be thicker than others, and then expanded consciousness, although it's aware of more things, has greater difficulty in getting that information through to the.
But as we reduce our limiting beliefs, if you like, that actual ring can become sort of thinner, so there's more access from the larger areas of consciousness into the ego consciousness. So, yes, it's not fixed. The sort of thickness of the ring isn't fixed as we expand our understanding of the nature of reality, and therefore reduce our limiting beliefs about who we are, what we are, and what life is, so we can be more connected to the larger areas.
And would you say that in states of higher consciousness that are accessed through maybe Kundalini yoga, where you have like a Kundalini awakening, or maybe even to the extreme Buddhist monks who have supposedly meditated to a point that they can become light bodies. Would that be an example of where you are dissolving that middle ring to where you are then becoming almost one with the outer ring?
Yes, and there are no limitations on this, because there are no limitations to conscious awareness. And so and we will illustrate this with a representation of two people, if you like, in a moment. But that outer ring can be much bigger and encompass much greater awareness of the whole of reality. And so can an ego consciousness can be more aware of it. So yes, people that have spent time in meditation or various exercises to be able to tap into and become aware of the outer ring, which can keep expanding. They can sort of flip between one and the other. So for practical purposes, they're obviously in a reality that uses the five senses, so that they can move around in it and interact in that reality. But at other times, and at the same time, they can be aware of the outer ring and the consciousness that that has of, and understanding that has of a greater knowledge of reality.
That will help to explain or to be a visual. This is a visualization of what we were talking about last time with Ingo Swan and various people who can remote view, that they can see other areas of reality, but not necessarily in the same so-called time frame.
Mm-hmm.
Because we said that there were some instances where he was viewing particular coordinates, but what he was the image and the information he was bringing back wasn't in the same so-called time frame, and that's because it's that's again because the time is not fixed, and so his expanded awareness, as you can see from the larger ring, does take into account other what may have been called past as well as future. So again, it's the time as well as the space that's expanded, if you like.
You can even extend that into people who are able to remember aspects of their past lives, or what they say is their past life, with extreme accuracy, like with like spot on. They're remembering exactly where they were, exactly who they were, their name, their mother's name, the house that they lived in. And then there's been examples where people have traveled to those locations, and this is a 4 or 5, 6-year-old kid saying these things that lived in Japan, and they lived in England in a specific village, and are able to describe it with complete accuracy. And that could be another example of this.
Yes,
well, exactly. We will talk about insights into reincarnation, shall we say, but when we sort of are more relaxed, shall we say, about this strange concept of past, present, and future all existing simultaneously, i.e., time is a construct, then we will have to take a different view of reincarnation, exactly what that is, and multiple lives, and it's all part of this expanded awareness. So we'll try and progress a little at a time.
But one point again, you were saying about children, and when they are not too restricted, or when they're not sort of restricted by sort of schooling systems, they are more aware. They have a wider an understanding of consciousness, if you like. They have a it's not until they are taught to restrict how they think about time and space and this reality, and then that's restricted, they are far more open to these kinds of ideas, which is why it's not at all surprising that they are small children who have these much more vivid, I know they're called memories, but again, this sort of awareness of other areas of consciousness that they identify with.
Okay, so just to literally expand on this a little more, let's turn our attention back to the small ring, which is surrounding one square, and the one square is representing an event. It can be a small event, you know, it can be something like going to the shops or getting into your car, or and that's a probability. Now, as you can see, immediately adjacent to that one square, there are a number of other squares adjacent to it, and they all represent other probable outcomes. For instance, in basic terms, you may decide, as I said, to go to the shops or not to go to the shop, or go to this shop or that shop, or to go in your car or to walk. All of those are probabilities which can branch out from the one event that the small ring is encompassing. But as you can see, all of those probabilities, although they're different probable outcomes that ego consciousness can decide to take, but they all exist simultaneously, represented by all of the adjacent squares. And it's quite an important point to be thought about here. If all of those probabilities exist, even if you don't take them, you know, but they still exist, and extended out into the future, so-called future. But the same thing, and this is the interesting thing also, is that it extends into what we think of as our past. So if the small ring were to just look backwards in a straight line to its left over each square, thinking that each of those squares is an event in its life, and normally our everyday consciousness, that's what is in memory and what gives us the illusion of a single past. But as you can see, each of those squares is always has adjacent squares right up against it, and each of those adjacent squares also represent probabilities. So
you think this is like what people describe as timelines, like almost like separate timelines almost?
Yes. Yes. So what the ego consciousness can do, and this is what I was alluding to in our last conversation, is knowing that all of these probabilities exist simultaneously and can be chosen by present day consciousness. So you can look back in your presumed past to an event, one of those squares going off to the left, which might have been uncomfortable or undesirable or even horrific, and decide to choose one of the other probable outcomes which also exist, another one of the squares which were adjacent to it. So you could choose, and this is the difficult part for people to get their heads around, to realize that all of those other probabilities actually exist. It's recognized in quantum physics as the sort of multiverse concept. So because this is a real thing, and once you know that all of these other probable outcomes did exist and are just as real in consciousness as the one that is actually held in memory by present day consciousness, you can concentrate on a different outcome from the past. And once you can believe that that actually existed equally as much as the one that you thought was the only one, that can then, as you can see, you'd run a different parallel, as you put it, timeline. And to the present, where the ring is at the moment, you would have a string of different probable outcomes, which would be just as real as the one you remembered. And that would change what was happening in your present, and consequently what would happen into your so-called future, because you were choosing and starting from a different, one of your different probable pasts. And so you now have a different present and a different, obviously, probable future. Okay. A difficult concept to get around. And it's only, and you can play with this, you know, as we said last time, like building your muscles up at the gym. This is building up your conscious muscles, if you like, to completely change your understanding of what reality is. And once you can get past that first barrier that the small steel ring is encompassing of just viewing reality through the five senses, once you can move more into your expanded awareness of reality in the bigger ring, and you can see it encompasses much more, and so can do more, and therefore it frees you up from the very limited present that you have. Okay, so I think if we move on to the next ring, next slide, just for sake of illustration, really, we've got two sets of ego consciousness, and yes, I know the ego rings are of different thicknesses, and that represents because people from an ego point of view, ego consciousness and their five senses can have different fears, hopes, desires,
different belief systems,
different beliefs, limitations. So that's just to sort of illustrate that. But they all have this expanded state of consciousness too, which can also vary, but for sake of illustration here, they're both the same. But if these, let's say, represented two people, two different people operating through their ego consciousness, and they're, again, got one little probable square that they're surrounding, and as they move along, creating time and space as they do so. But in connection with another person, let's say they're represented by the larger rings, which can come into contact with one another. Now, any views of reality and any views of what they think of as another person, which the large ring may be aware of, it still has to pass that information through the small ring. So any views that, let's say, small ring on the left has of the small ring on the right will be based on its beliefs, its hopes, its fears, its desires, and all the rest of it. So this is why we can say we each really create our own life experiences, because it's based on what we believe, what we allow in through that small steel ring, and our concepts and perceptions of not only the greater reality are limited by it, but our concepts of other people, so-called, are limited by it. Now, although the large rings in each case have a much greater awareness, as I said earlier, any knowledge and awareness in the larger ring still has to get through the small steel ring barrier to be able to get that information into everyday ego consciousness. And that's why we need to train ourselves to be more flexible in our understanding and our beliefs, because as we can see from the great massive squares, all reality, all probabilities, all so-called past, present, and future exist simultaneously, and we can become aware of it. Okay, we're only representing sort of as if it was two people here, but of course there's no limit to the amount of consciousness, and we'll sort of expand on that. There are no, although we're sort of showing as if there are barriers in consciousness, there isn't really. There are no real barriers in consciousness. It's only the ones that we form through our misunderstanding. Okay. I think if we move on to the next one. So this can give us a different insight into reincarnation. Now you can see, I think people can make it out. The process
I love that image. Wow.
Sorry?
Yeah, it's great, isn't it?
The process of reincarnation is sort of illustrated there. So I think it's fairly self-explanatory. But of course, it's relying on time's arrow, isn't it? You know, that we're born, we live, and we die. And then,
can you describe it a little bit, David and Don, what you're seeing here for the people who are just listening via audio?
Okay, so what we've got in the illustration here as the process of reincarnation is, well, starting on the left, we've got the man growing older as time goes on until he dies, and through, as we've got the sign of infinity there, and then he's reborn and starts out as a baby and growing through a child and back into a man again. And that would be, under the normal understanding of reincarnation, how that would work. And that can go on infinitely, as the infinity sign would indicate, until, as some religions in Buddhism, for instance, would say, that until enlightenment is reached and the process of reincarnation ceases. But the process of reincarnation is not really taken into account the fact that we've just been showing that time doesn't exist. So it's not a case of one life after another in succession, because we're back to time's arrow again.
Mm-hmm.
What we have to understand is that we have lots of different lives, if you like, lots of different experiences is probably best to think about it, and they're all simultaneous. It's only because of the limitations of ego consciousness that, for the most part, we're not aware of all of the other lives and activities that is still us in our greater awareness.
I kind of visualize that as like the grid that you showed on the previous slides, right? It was in a, obviously showing it in a 2-dimensional model, but if you put that grid in 3 dimensions and it extended in depth as well, that
Yes.
one ring with a middle ring that is more of the egoic individuated portion of consciousness extends this way too, almost as if it's like a tube. So in other areas of the grid, you're living simultaneous lives, and that's
Yes.
how you're existing outside of time in multiple dimensions, if you will.
Yeah,
Yes.
and another way is that we use the dream state sometimes for helpful explanations. Whereas if you, when you just first wake up and you've had a dream, you are awake, but you can still, if you like, remember the dream. So you can be in both, if you like, both realities at the same time. You can be aware of both experiences, and they're both as real as each other, but they're in different states of consciousness. So that's one way of seeing how you can be aware of other experiences in other states of consciousness at the same time.
We sometimes use the example, and like all examples, they're never perfect. If you imagine 2 television sets, let's say, back to back, and you're sat in front of one television set and you can see what's happening on the screen, but you can't see the other one. But then, if you think of that as one state of consciousness, you can get up and walk around and you can sit down in front of the other television set, which is running at the same time, and you can see something different to the first television set. But again, you're now no longer aware of the other television set and what's happening on it. But if you then turn the television sets so that they're side by side, so that you can view both of them at the same time, that's akin to expanding awareness. You can now see 2 different states happening at the same time. And then, of course, you can multiply that, as we've seen, into our godlike position.
It's pretty incredible, because so there's this book, it's called LSD in the Mind of the Universe by Christopher M. Bach. And in this book, he did controlled experiments with LSD in very high doses. And what he describes in the book is taking on the form of, a black woman who was beaten, taking on the form of a man in Siberia. And some of the parts that he describes in his LSD controlled experiments is taking on the form of someone who is living simultaneous to him, but it was fundamentally him, like living a life simultaneous to his own in the same time.
Exactly. And this is when we, some people have, through altered their states of perception through artificial means, i.e. drugs, hallucinogenics. But some of those things, and by no means am I making recommendations here, but for those who've tried mind-altering drugs will realize that in those altered states of consciousness, the states of consciousness that can be encountered, bizarre as they may seem and strange as they may seem, but they seem perfectly real. And because they are, they're just altered states of consciousness, because everything we experience is altered states of consciousness. As we said in the first episode, there's there is no proof of a solid external world to us. And again, quantum physics are quite happy with this. They can't prove it. And we talked about energy, stroke consciousness, and how quantum physics recognize that energy, mass, and consciousness are the same thing. So we can manipulate it, and we're not limited by it. And as we've said, time and space are constructions of consciousness. And we slowly, as we expand our awareness of what reality truly is, and what time and space truly are, and reincarnation truly are, we can start to break down those barriers and have a greater awareness of reality. And then we can work with it and manipulate it in different ways. And we can get rid of many of the fears that we had before. For instance, even death is, we in our true nature are immortal and timeless. And we'll come on to what the source of all being is in probably in just a moment. In fact, we can probably move on from this slide now. And this probably sums it up, really. We are the one. Now, some people may be offended by this and think we're saying that we're God. But in a way, we are. And I think I may have mentioned it before, because one of the early Christian mystics, I think it was Clements of Alexandria, and he was a Christian mystic, but used to teach his acolytes to practice being God. And many Christians would be deeply offended by that. But he was trying really to get this point across, that we are all one. And it's, as it says there, only egos, beliefs, and fears separate us. So this greater understanding of what reality is and what we are, we think of ourselves as individual because we speak of ourselves as individuals. We use the terms we and you and me and them. We don't have an all-inclusive language that we understand. And so we're constantly reminding ourselves or indoctrinating ourselves into thinking of ourselves as separate from the reality that we experience and separate from all other beings, in fact, all other life, whether it's animal, mineral, plant, humans. There are no separations in consciousness. There are not different sets of consciousness. There's not human consciousness and animal consciousness and plant consciousness. There's just consciousness, which is the source of all created things. And the source of consciousness is this strange, what some people would call God. We sometimes refer to it as the self. It's all that is. It's the source, which uses consciousness for creating. It uses consciousness like a potter would use clay. The clay in itself is just clay, but then the potter molds it into whatever he wants that is suitable for the purpose that he wants to achieve.
Well, and that's why we're all different, so that the source can experience itself and have experiences that are as different as possible, but at the same time there are infinite varieties, and that's why we are all different. However similar we may be, there are always differences, and our experiences are always different, so that experience, the source can experience reality in as many ways as possible.
It's just worth, if I just I don't know whether I did this last time, but it's worth going over it, just a few sentences which sort of try to get this concept across. I'll refer to it as the source. I don't know if in the next slide, if you just want to move on. No, we don't want that one just yet. Yeah, the source perceives but cannot be perceived from ego consciousness. The source is a point of knowing all, but to experience all requires the creation of space and time. The source is a state of being that uses consciousness as a tool to explore itself. Hence the analogy of the potter and the clay. The source desires to know itself completely, but because of its limitless nature, it cannot do so. And herein lies the mystery of eternity and continuous exploration. The source is the source of all states of consciousness, including the waking state of consciousness. All experiences are experiences in consciousness, no matter what form they take. And all consciousness is connected and interacts, and there are no divisions. So hopefully that will explain a little more about the source, this mysterious thing, because people often want to know more about it, and this is why many of the mystics,
well, they are it.
Yes, we are all it, but it's why, when asked to explain it, why they remain silent, because they know they can't. We are limited by our five senses. We're limited by three-dimensional concepts.
It's more of a feeling too, like especially for those who go into deep meditation. It's something that you can't quite put into words with our limited language or into descriptions or models. And it's like, I've been thinking this the whole time we've been doing this episode. What you're pointing to with all of your analogies and everything like that are incredible ways of describing it, but even they are limiting for like the essence of what it is. And like, and I hope you don't take offense to that, but it is just the reality. It's like what we're pointing to is something that I think you have to not only be able to describe, but you have to have felt it to truly understand it. You know what I mean?
Yes,
absolutely.
The point you make, sorry, sort of, but you're saying that what we're pointing to, and it's not that we're describing it, but we're pointing to it, so that with the words that we can use, that then help people to know it without it being an intellectual exercise. It's an intuitive exercise. As you say, it's a feeling. It's when you hear something and it's not necessarily the words, but there's something that clicks and you know it, you feel it. It's something that you absolutely feel and know. I mean, I remember the first time I heard the phrase, "You're as dead now as you're ever going to be." I mean, that just hit me so hard, and yet it was so empowering, so uplifting. And it was that kind of, yes, I kind of knew it, if you like, but I didn't know. I'd never heard those words before.
Yeah, it's revealing something that you had always felt, and it's bringing it into words for the first time, right? Like it's verbalizing what you've always known and felt to be true, but couldn't quite describe.
Yes, and we're not offended by the fact that that we can only point to things because of the limitations of language. And this is where that mysterious thing called intuition, to put a name on it, comes into play. It's knowing something without knowing how you know it. It's that feeling. And this is really, that was represented partly by the larger ring on our little diagram, which is this greater awareness. And it's where intuition comes into play. Intellect can only take you so far in this understanding, because it can only operate within three-dimensional time and space. But of course, reality is much greater than that. So otherwise it'd be like trying to get a pint of water into a half-pint pot. The lesser can't encompass the greater. And so intellect, being the lesser, can only go so far. And we're obviously today dealing with intellect and trying to, as Dawn said, point people in a certain direction so that their intellect can then hand over to intuition and a greater awareness through this other state of consciousness, this greater expanded state of consciousness, where more insights can start to come in from this expanded state of consciousness, can come into the understanding of ego consciousness, and so expand ego consciousness too. And that's really what we're trying to do here.
I think in some ways a lot of people have been changing the word understanding to inner standing, and I think this might actually be something, you know, sort of an area where that word may be more appropriate as well, because it is it is an inner, if you like, understand. It's an inner something that's going on that you feel, and that's again why it's for us to know ourselves and not be always led by these external bodies and authorities and all of that. And that's why it is so important that we know who we are from the inside, and that's really what we have been led away from. And we've been taught, you know, thinking of yourself is selfish. Well, it isn't, when inner standing of yourself, if you like, is absolutely key to being able to operate within this state of consciousness in the way that you want to have the life experiences that you want to have.
And that's why I'm so I repeatedly say it's important to trust your own observations and experiences. It's because I'm pointing people back to getting in touch with themselves. Like, so many people aren't even aware that they have an intuition. So how do we break into that? It's getting them to, okay, come back to, this is what I'm observing in reality. This is what I'm experiencing. It's diametrically opposed to what these people are telling me is going on. That's pretty interesting. What do I actually think about it? And that's the process of doing that inner work and inner reflection and introspection to begin to get in touch with your intuition again, so you have that inner standing.
Yes, I think, as we've probably said before, and many people have started to touch onto it now, with the way that we are brought up and educated, or as we like to say, indoctrinated, is limits us in our concepts of not only the world as we think it might be, but also limits it as regards what we think of as ourselves. And we're taught to think of ourselves as separate beings, and of course, stemming from that comes all sorts of things. You know, our lack of respect sometimes for other life forms, whether it's animal or human or trees and plants, whatever it is, not realizing that it's all part of what we are. We are all one. So in a way, harming anything, and this is why we always say to proceed without causing harm, because in a way, if you harm things, knowingly that is, you're harming yourself, because we're all one and all connected. And that's really what we're in this reality at this moment to learn. You know, it's to realize that we are the one, manifest as the many in all different ways, and to know ourselves as the ocean of being, you know, and just knowing those and exploring and contemplating those phrases. We are the one, manifest as the many, and to know ourselves as the ocean of being. Knowing those things and contemplating those little phrases will start to expand awareness. It will start to break the shackles that we've been trained to believe in all our lives. And as we've said before, it's this knowing about what we truly are that is kept from us deliberately, because once we know that and start to grow into our true nature, our true power, then everything will change. We will change the world that we experience through the five senses. We will change it in a way that we want it to be. And we believe that this manifestation of a fake pandemic, because it's not real, And that's provable from a scientific point of view. But it's having the benefit of starting to get more people start to question things. Now, they're questioning things about health, which is good. So they can take that power back into themselves and realize they don't want to be taking drugs and anything else. Health is a natural thing. But it's also just the first step for people as they're to grow into themselves, is to start asking other questions. As we've said before, is the legal system really good? Is the banking system really good? And all of these different things, and they'll start to question it and realize that all of these things can be changed. They are not fait accompli, as it were, that's how the world is. No, the world is not like that. It's far stranger, as we've sort of alluded to in just this little chat. It's far stranger than people can possibly imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And as we explain sort of with our other work in the health field, it's about taking responsibility for ourselves, which does require us to think about ourselves and how we are, but to take responsibility for our own actions and not being reliant on sort of external authorities, experts, whatever you want to call them. And by doing that, that's how the limiting beliefs and ideas and fears, and again, fear has been pretty major in the past couple of years. So by understanding who we are, the fear is reduced, minimized, and hopefully even kind of completely eliminated. And then that sort of small ring will, the edge of that will be thinner, and then you can be more aware of expanded consciousness. I mean, I know many people are learning that, but that's how we understand more of who we are. And then we take the power back, take the responsibility back for our own lives, for our own experiences, because we understand how that works. And it does start from ourselves. And I have to repeat, it's not about being selfish, but by understanding how it starts, but by affecting how you are affecting then your experiences. So you're affecting what you interact with, if you like, externally. As so it's an ongoing process. It's not.
You must go internal. You must go internal into yourself in order to understand that there is a bigger self that we are talking about here.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And that's why over many of the mystery temples, and I'm thinking particularly of the oracle at Delphi in Greece, it said above the temple door, it said, "Man, know thyself." And the simple words, but that's hidden within that small phrase of "man, know thyself" is what we're talking about. Once you know what you are, you're not just flesh and blood and you live, you're born, you live and you die. There's much more to us than that. Once you know yourself, then that's the start of it. And that's this, as I keep saying, when we can grow into ourselves and know what we truly are, that we are limitless, that we are eternal, we're immortal, and we are the one manifest as the many. We are all one, as the little picture shows. I don't know whether it's worth, I think I may have used it last time, but it's worth, I know you're familiar with this work of Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj, because I love these words, because I think it sums up everything we've been saying. And I often recommend it. It is in our little book about the nature of reality. It is in there. And we recommend people to literally contemplate it as often as they can. So I'll just read through it. It's very brief. "You have made this world and you can change it. The world, of which you are the only source and ground, is fully within your power to change. What is created can always be dissolved and recreated. All will happen as you want it, provided you really want it. You have created the world's sorrows out of your own desires and fears. You deal with them. All is due to your having forgotten your own being, having given reality to the picture on the screen. You love its people and suffer for them, and seek to save them. It is just not so. You must begin with yourself. There is no other way. And that, I believe, sums it all up. And
I love that so much.
it's a beautiful,
it's
beautiful piece.
Yeah, it's, well, there's no words to describe it. It is absolutely beautiful.
To go back. So we'll sort of come out of that, I think, if we can find our way back on here.
And for those who are wondering where this quote came from, I'm pretty sure it's from this book. It's called I Am That. And
yes, our copy is slightly different. It's a yellow cover, but it is from I Am That. Absolutely,
it is
definitely,
that book, yeah.
yes.
such
An amazing
incredible book.
Well worth a read. I recommend it to everyone.
Well
Yeah.
well, not a read, but lots of reads. Sorry, go on.
No. So I wanted to comment on something you said, David, with regards to source, universe, consciousness, whatever you want, whatever name you want to call it, God.
Sure.
Wanting to know itself. And this is something that I've, learned through a book that I was reading called The Law of One. And, The Law of One is a channeled material. I do believe channeling is real. I'm very skeptical of many people who say that they are channels. I'm not sure of where I stand on extraterrestrial life and UFOs and stuff like that, but that's not relevant to the conversation. What is relevant is what The Law of One describes as going through the veil of forgetting when we incarnate into this life, and the purpose of forgetting that we are fundamentally one being, one consciousness, modulating in an infinite number of unique ways. And what it describes is source incarnates into this appearance of a separate self in an appearance of a finite form, with free will, without the understanding of who and what we fundamentally are, so that it can make more authentic choices in this lifetime. Because if we were to incarnate here with the full understanding that we are fundamentally consciousness, we are fundamentally one, we would never make any decision ever to go against that, because we would know that we are harming ourselves in the process anytime we manipulate, exploit, lie to, harm, try to cheat someone that is the appearance of other. We would know that they are not other. So in order for source to fully know itself, it undergoes this process of forgetting. I'd like to hear your comments on that.
No,
Well,
I agree with that.
okay.
I mean, we sometimes use a little example which is somewhat more mundane, but I think it illustrates the point of, say, a person who was comfortably off. They had a nice house and warmth and food and all the rest of it, but they wanted to understand what poverty was. So they thought to try and understand it, they'd put on some old clothes and go and live in under a bridge somewhere for a few weeks. Now, you think, well, yeah, you're going to feel pretty uncomfortable for a few weeks, but you're not really going to understand what poverty is, because you've got a nice house and a car and food to go back to. So it would be a little bit of a hollow experience. And really what you've described is that. But if you forgot and didn't know you had the nice warm house and good job and money and food to go back to, then you would really experience poverty in its true sense, because you'd know nothing else. And it's really that sort of thing. So yes, you're quite right.
Great analogy.
So for the self, as we've said, the source, God, whatever you want to call it, to know itself, remember this is all happening simultaneously. It is exploring itself. As I said, but because of its limitless nature, it goes on forever, looking at everything that could possibly be, because it's limitless. And but it is quite a difficult thing to get our heads around. But yes, I would agree with your analogy too. And it's these little analogies, although not perfect in themselves, but they do start to help people get their intellect around something which is greater than intellect. And as Dawn said earlier, it just points in certain directions, and then you have to follow that path and gain that understanding through study and through contemplation, at least of a particular thing.
But going back to your point of channeling, if you go back to the sort of idea of the material with the sort of small ring of the ego, channeling is expanding consciousness into other areas and perceiving the information to be coming from another being, as it were, but it's not necessarily it's not a separate being.
You verbalized it so well, because that's like, you hear people describe it in different ways. I'm channeling beings of higher realms, or I had my angels talk to me, or my guides talk to me, or maybe I prayed to Saint Michael, Jesus appeared to me. It's like consciousness forms itself in ways that we can conceptualize to communicate to, like, it's ultimately the self, the eternal self that is all things, finding a way to impress upon us information that we can, so that we can describe it with our limited capacity to, you get what I'm saying? It's like,
Yes.
Yeah.
it
Yes.
doesn't matter the form, it's ultimately all the same thing.
Yes.
It is, but it's knowing that we are accessing expanded areas of
Yes.
consciousness, our expanded areas of
Yes.
consciousness, not another person, another being, I beg your pardon,
Yeah.
communicating with us from the other side, if you like. It's we're accessing expanded consciousness and giving ourselves information, if you like.
Yeah.
And everyone is part of this. We are the ocean of consciousness. We're not, in our true sense, we're not individuals. As we keep saying, we are one. I mean, all of the great religions and the mystics talk about the nature of oneness, but not many people really understand what that means. Well, it means
Even
exactly
Jesus
what it
did.
says. We are one. We are all one, but we manifest as if we're individuals for the reasons that we've just given. But once we step back from that and realize our true nature, then we can start to dispense with these limiting concepts and this limited vocabulary that we have. It's necessary for the reasons so that we can experience things. Well, again, I'll use another analogy. It'd be a bit like saying you'd never swum before. You'd never swum, so or done any swimming, but you thought, well, I want to know about it. So you get a book that's all about swimming, and you read it, or you learn about diving and breaststroke and all. You can know everything about swimming, but it will never be the same as getting in the water and actually swimming. And that's really what this reality is about. It's consciousness exploring itself by getting in the water and actually swimming.
And sometimes it feels like being in the deep end, but
yes.
Yeah, it does.
So it can take all forms and does take all forms, but it's all about true exploration, not just thinking about, actually knowing something. And that's like with the swimming analogy. To truly know swimming, you have to actually get in the water and swim. And it's if people think about that, they'll see the greater picture. Okay. Well, I know, well, we've been going for about an hour, but we don't want to labour this too much unless there's any other questions that people want to ask. I don't know whether there's people listening to this live and have questions, but otherwise it's a case of we can obviously recommend that people buy our little book, The Nature of Reality, which explains...
Is the website the natureofreality.com? I think I had it as a
that's
banner
correct.
that appeared.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we talk about all these things. That's it, thenatureofreality.com. We talk about these things in greater depth, obviously, in it. And but it's one of those books. Although it's only a small book, it's not a great tome like our health book. But there's the concepts are there, so it's quite small.
It's not a tome. But
we have one question actually from one of the listeners. Go ahead, Don, and I have a question.
No, I'm just saying it's not, it's not sort of, it isn't a tome, but it's not one of those that you just kind of read it through necessarily. It's one to kind of take the concepts and sort of sit and contemplate them and think about them
and go through it many times.
Take it through intuitively. But again, it's the sort of thing you can keep coming back to as often as possible, and hopefully people will always get new insights each time they read it, because it's not, oh well, I've read it, I know it. It really isn't that, because
it's not a book. It's not a book of facts.
No, it's an ongoing. Life is an ongoing exploration.
Well, that's how I felt when I read I Am That, and that's also how I felt when I read The Law of One. Like, reading them multiple times, there's always new insights, and I look at something in a different way, like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I missed this before.
Yeah.
Well, you get the information you need at the right time.
Yes, exactly. So here's the question we have. This is from Kathy Miller. It seems that we are truly, truly individuals, as well as being one with all. Thoughts?
Yes, we definitely, for all the reasons that we've mentioned, we have to have and work with this illusion of being an individual for the purposes of experiencing in this particular reality. But we have to learn that we are one, that we are all one. And it is a bit like a juggling act, whereas you need to be able to use the five senses and operate in this reality that we've created for the purposes of the five senses. But as you get this greater understanding of what you truly are, you can balance. It's a balancing act. It's a juggling act that you don't allow yourself to be drawn into all the fears. Once you know what reality is, all of the fears that are pushed at us in all directions, particularly from the mainstream media. I mean, look what's happening over this last 2 years or so, all based on nothing. And then we have the war in Ukraine, so there's always something that they're wanting to scare us with, either that's happening now or in the future. But when we know what we truly are, we can withdraw from all of that and not let it affect us. But we still operate as an individual, but are aware that we are one and all powerful at the same time. And that's the juggling act. It takes a bit of getting used to, but you can get a better balance in life as you become more aware of that.
And our experiences as individuals are all relevant to the overall learning, the overall experience of source, if you like. So we are all as important, and our experiences are important. It's knowing and understanding, having this inner standing, or however we want to call it, of who we truly are, that we can change our individual experiences. And that is where the real understanding kind of develops into how we live our lives, and that gives us the sense of power over our own experiences as individuals, but knowing we are all one. It is a strange concept.
We often say to people that because they can realize that they don't have a fixed past any more than they have a fixed future, therefore the point of power is the present moment. And I think people have written about this. The power is in the present moment, yes. The power of now. And from this moment, you can decide what you want and which directions you're going to take, and get rid of old limiting beliefs. Sometimes it's useful to write down what you think are facts and what are just beliefs. And it can be quite revealing.
So important.
And you can dispense with a lot of things and realize, well, that wasn't a fact after all. That was just a belief. And as you get rid of these limiting beliefs, you can start to grow more into yourself. So it is quite important that.
Yeah, and it's not that beliefs themselves are inherently bad. It's
No.
that beliefs that have been impressed upon. It's that we need to dissect each belief in and of itself and look at where it's coming from. Is it stemming from some information that was impressed upon me, that someone told me I should believe in, something that happened in my life that made me believe something about myself? It's not that the beliefs are inherently bad. It's that each of them needs to be looked at for you to determine if they are authentically coming from within you based on your own observations and experiences, and if they are bringing you closer to that which you are, which is ultimately consciousness, source, God manifest in physical form.
Yeah. I mean, look at, again, looking at it from a more mundane point of view, the world situation that we have now is all brought about by limiting beliefs, isn't it? The limiting beliefs of doctors and virologists, who, as we've said many times, they're not all evil people, but they have a set of beliefs, what they were taught or indoctrinated at college, and they're carrying out those beliefs. But if we can get them to dispense with those beliefs, because they're not scientific, they're not based on anything of any, in the true sense of science, imagine how the world would change if all of the medical system in all its manifestations got rid of those limiting beliefs about germs and drugs and all the rest of it and went into natural health. Amazing. It truly, as you know, true health freedom.
A good friend of mine, Garrett Kramer, describes it as pretty much everything, if not everything, actually everything that is happening in the world is rooted in the belief, the conditioned belief of separation, that we are separate, finite entities.
Yes.
And from everything that I've looked at, I think that's absolutely true, that ultimately it's rooted in the belief of that we are finite, limited, lacking separate selves. And if we attach onto that belief, then we're going to develop coping mechanisms to try to ensure and preserve our ability to exist, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And, the whole thoughts of acquisition come from that, don't they? Where people will go to extraordinary lengths to acquire, whether it's wealth or possessions or power, whatever it is all based on self-aggrandizement is a good thing, because if you believe you're a separate individual and can get ahead by acquiring of these things, not realizing that, as we say, we're all one. And don't get me wrong, I'm not decrying wealth. Again, like everything, it's how you use it, or power, it's how you use it. If you have influence, it's how you use it. And all of these things can be and should be used for good. Because otherwise, as we've said, because we're all one, if you harm others, you are effectively harming yourself, because we're all one. It'd be like thinking your left hand is less than your right hand, so you abuse it and let it get damaged. Well, that would be ridiculous.
You put a mask on
ridiculous, wouldn't it? It's all part of you. Your left hand is not less than your right, or your left foot less than your right foot. It's all one and functions as a whole. And the whole of humanity is one and should function as a whole and not function disjointedly in the way that we get trained to do. It's not a natural thing. It's what we're trained to do deliberately from very early in our lives. And so that's got to change, and everything else will change with it.
Beautiful. This was an amazing discussion. Just to reiterate one more time, the depth of understanding both of you have in so many areas is really incredible. And I'm so excited to be able to meet you in person someday, now that our overlords are opening things up and letting us travel. So I hope to see you both in person very soon.
That would be wonderful.
We would love that very much. And of course, because we want it, we will have it. These people that are seeming in power, we let's take it away from them because we are the power. We are the power. And the more we realize we are the power, and we can have what we want and truly expect that to happen, then our freedom is there, and it's there for us to operate in, and we should operate in it. As we said, I think, or maybe I didn't say it in our last one, I used a saying from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, to be a courageous person, just don't take part in the lie. And it's as simple as that. You don't have to go on marches. You don't have to, certainly don't have to attack others. Just don't take part in the lie. And if everyone did that, it would be over.
This is such a good point. I don't remember if I brought this up last episode. I probably brought it up on several episodes because it's so important. I loved the unity surrounding the Canadian trucker convoy. Love the unity surrounding it. But what I absolutely hate about it is that what they are doing in that act is that they are reaffirming that, oh, you have power over me and I disagree with the power that you have over me. And if all of those people, and there were 500,000, I forget how many, loads of people just simply decided to be free, take their monopoly pieces off of the monopoly board and no longer participate in that illusion, it would all be over. That's all it would take for all of this nonsense to stop, is for us to stop acquiescing and stop consenting to it, stop participating in it, stop giving it energy, stop upholding the false illusion of authority that they have.
Exactly. And just in those simple words, as I say, don't take part in the lie. Because people often ask us, well, what can we do? And that's the short answer. Well, don't take part in the lie. We're not asking you to go out in the streets and protest, or certainly not attack the police or the army. It's just don't take part in the lie. And if that's easy, isn't it? You don't have to do anything other than don't take part in the lie. And everything will change if enough people do that. And want not, as we say to people, we're not wanting to, as some people go, return to how it was before COVID. No, because it was crap then. So
exactly. I don't want the. Yes, we do need a new normal, but it's not that one. It's not the World Economic Forum's new normal.
It was the situation, the conditions that were existing beforehand that were enabled that nonsense to actually manifest itself. So yes, we certainly don't want that. The one thing that I, again with what you were saying about the unity of the truckers, again with so-called protests, I think it's been amazing that people have come together. So they've connected with each other, made contact. It's given them the confidence that they aren't crazy, because many people have been told, because they won't follow these instructions, that they've been told by the people around them, oh, you're crazy. And that's left them feeling sort of unsettled, to put it mildly. So connecting with other people who think the same way, that gives them the confidence and the strength to keep going. Whereas if they didn't make those connections, they may well have just said, I just can't do it. It's too much for me. So having that mutual support, having that that contact with other people and that strength, it has allowed people to keep going, not complying.
Well, that's it.
Not acquiescing. And so there is that part that is important. So again, the being individual doesn't mean you have to go and be a hermit on your own. Yeah. You connect with people, but the more you understand about who and what you are, you will connect with like-minded people as your limiting beliefs start to drop away and they start to become less limiting, and you then realize who you are, what you can do, and then you'll find your experiences are then matching those less restricted beliefs, and then you will move into connecting with like-minded people, and then that's how your experiences change. I mean, I know some people have said, oh, it's my life has changed. Well, but in many ways they've said, but it's great, I've met these all these, and it's been like that for me. It's been a real shift towards meeting like-minded people, but wonderful people who are helping me sort of move forward as well. So it's all
but it's important to concentrate, simple things, to concentrate on what you want, not what you don't want. Because as you rightly said, Alec, otherwise you're giving power to what you don't want. And so it's the old saying, isn't it? Love peace, don't hate war.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're saying. Concentrate on what you want, create what you want, and take power away from what you don't want. Don't think about it. Don't support it in any way. And protesting against something, as you rightly said, you're giving strength and energy to what you're protesting against. So take that energy away.
Yeah, and this is a verse from the Bible, Matthew chapter 18, verse 19 through 20. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. And how I take that verse is that when we gather, it's extremely powerful if we're all aligning our thoughts, feelings, and actions towards a common goal to bring into being the reality that we want. And just like you said, Don, absolutely, when we gather, even if it is for a protest, just the act of gathering like that is so validating. We're all on the same page. I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. Here's what we really want. It's about the intention behind the gathering. If you're gathering to, say that, you have power over me and I don't agree with that power, I want you to change the way you're wielding your power over me. That's, in my opinion, not the right intention. If you're gathering for how can we come together, we're all not crazy, these are the solutions we want to bring into being, that's the power. That's how we change the reality. And sometimes what it takes is us to have those elements of you're coming together in protest. And it's so that you find the others. And then once you find the others, it's like, okay, there's enough of us now. We don't need to protest anymore. Let's get together and figure and start creating and implementing the solutions that we want, and just pretend that system doesn't even exist anymore. We acknowledge that it is what it is right now, but that's not what we want. So we're going to acknowledge it, but we're going to align our thoughts, feelings, and actions towards something that we do want.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And to understand that these things are not fixed, like the little saying that we read through, what's been created can be dissolved. Nothing is not permanent. It's created because of our fears and beliefs of what is possible and what is not possible. So we can change all those because they are just beliefs. So there is no power structure that can't disappear. And it doesn't have to be, and should not be, through armed insurrection. That's no good. It's been tried many times in the past and it's never worked. So it's not the right way.
No, it's as you say,
it's
Alec,
the change in consciousness that is the important thing. And that's what will bring about the change. And that's what this awakening is being forced upon people to look at. This coronavirus nonsense is what is forcing people to examine it and look at, is there something true about this, which they find isn't, and then they will change and start to question more and change their beliefs, get rid of the faulty beliefs and take on board a new understanding of what reality is and bring about the changes that they want. And that's really what this is all about. Very important time.
Beautiful. Well, thank you both for joining me. This has been an incredible conversation. I don't think I've ever had a dull conversation with either of you two. So this was amazing. And for those that are watching or listening, please go check out thenatureofreality.com. Also check out whatreallymakesyouill.com. Please buy both of their books. They're absolutely incredible. I have not read The Nature of Reality yet, but based on our conversations, I'm sure it's pretty incredible. What Really Makes You Ill, I have read, and that book, again, is like a Bible for health. And I highly recommend that you read it. Everyone should have that on their shelves. So thank you so much, Don and David, for everything that you do, all the awareness you're raising in multiple areas, and for being you, for being your individuated portion of consciousness and doing what you do in the world.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alec.
Really appreciate all of that. Thank you.
Lovely to talk to you as always.